Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
Good evening, everyone. If you enjoy our show and find our research both interesting and informative, please can I ask that you consider leaving us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Something that small really does help us out a huge amount. You can also find out more about us and our work by heading over to deadsouls.co.uk and checking us out. We are a small team of 3 researchers with more than 70 years of experience between us. You can also find us and speak to us over on Instagram. Just search Dead Souls Social Club and we'll come up. So, as always, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This audio presentation contains graphic details of death, violence, and controversial subject matter. Listener discretion is strongly advised. From Dead Souls Media, this is The War for the Falklands, Part 2. I'm Jamie Black, a researcher and psychologist, and I'll be your host for tonight. In our previous episode, we discussed the tensions between Argentina and the United Kingdom, the build-up to the war in the Falklands, and the opening salvo by the British against the Argentine targets. In the early days of the Falklands War, the British had sunk a key Argentinian naval destroyer, the General Belgrano. It resulted in a massive loss of Argentine lives. But now, the Argentine military wanted to exact revenge on the United Kingdom. The military junta in Buenos Aires, who were in a state of panic, surprise and frustration, were wholly stunned that the British would send a military task force more than 8,000 miles to engage in a fight over a small series of islands as far away from their home as they could possibly get. But to the British, the situation was a no-brainer. Argentina had threatened the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. It had endangered the lives of its citizens, and it had squared up to the British on the world stage. And Britain was not about to lose face in the eyes of the international community. But more than that, the Falkland Islands were thousands of miles away from the United Kingdom mainland. Sure, but irrespective of distance, the islands had been an overseas territory of the UK for 200 years. And any attack on it, or any other part of the United Kingdom, was a gross threat to Great Britain's national security and international integrity. Britain were not about to allow this attack to go unchecked. So let's dive back in for the second and final part of our series covering the Falklands War. If you haven't listened to the first part in this series, I suggest you head back and give that a listen first, before progressing with this one. Don't worry, we'll still be here waiting for you when you get back.
May the 1st, Saturday. This war at sea began for us at dawn on May Day. The ships of the task force had already crossed the perimeter of the total exclusion zone, that cordon sanitaire that both sides claim as their own. Our carriers, Hermes and Invincible, are at the center of the battle group, surrounded by their escorts of destroyers and frigates, and the Royal Fleet Auxiliaries, supply ships and tankers. By first light, May Day morning, we had already drawn first blood. Even as our Sea Harriers were being loaded with bombs for their first war sortie, we were told an RAF Vulcan bomber had flown the 8 hours from Ascension Island over 3,000 miles away and had bombed the airstrip close to Port Stanley. Below the flight deck, the Sea Harrier pilots from 800 Squadron, with a sprinkling from the Royal Air Force, were being given their individual combat tasks. 9 aircraft to Stanley, 3 to the airstrip at Darwin, 60 miles east. Their orders: to inflict maximum damage to military installations, radar, fuel dumps, vehicles, personnel, and, in the words of their operations officer, other soft-skinned targets. One by one, they waited in turn for the launch spot, Carefully, their ground crews, called grubbers, tucked them in, tightening this strap, easing that, a last-minute check on the ejection seat, another reminder of some irritating minor technical fault. 10 minutes to midday British time, but only just gone here, and they took off. A familiar sound and a familiar sight this past month in make-believe operational training exercises, but this was for real. Now they faced war in the air. 12 aircraft, 3 bombs apiece, 36,000 pounds of high explosive for 2 tiny Falkland airstrips. It was 25 minutes flying there, 25 back. And for the first time since we'd left Portsmouth, our flight deck was silent and empty. Our destroyer escort, HMS Broadsword, weaved about us. It's our goalkeeper, our protection, armed with Seawolf, the most advanced sea-to-air missile system in the world. Men and boys, some only 16 and 17 years old, scanned the sea and the sky from their ice-cold lookout turrets. The Royal Marines had set up makeshift machine gun positions, port and starboard, for anti-aircraft fire. We all pray never to hear them used. Then there was suddenly a cheer, a formation overhead, a victory roll, a count of the shapes in the sky, and all our aircraft had returned. The grins on the faces inside the cockpits and the thumbs up after the canopies had slid open confirmed their success. One Harrier had been slightly damaged, hit in the tail by a 20mm anti-aircraft shell. But within hours, it was repaired and the aircraft was back flying again.
It was 9:56 a.m. when Commander Augusto Bedoccaratz and Lieutenant Armando Mayora flew in very poor visibility. They were heading southwest towards the British task force stationed around 75 miles off the southern coast of the Falkland Islands. The planes, who had been flying less than 50 feet above sea level, popped up for a brief moment in order to activate their radar. They were looking for the British ships, but they could not immediately find anything. So the two pilots dropped their aircraft back down to sea level, hurtling at almost 600 miles per hour towards where their targets should have been located. They should be, they thought, around 50 miles away from the British by now. The British fleet at the time was sailing southwest away from the Falklands. The ships in the group were spread afar in an anti-air attack formation. The ships had dealt with repeated false alarms regarding incoming hostile aircraft that morning. The poor visibility and dark grey weather didn't help matters either. Within the formation, the most strategically important ships were positioned furthest east. The aircraft carriers, HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes, both carriers were accompanied by a Guardian ship armed with short-range Seawolf missiles. In front of these ships were further elements of protection. 3 Type 42 anti-air destroyers, which were positioned 20 miles ahead of the main force. HMS Coventry, HMS Glasgow, and HMS Sheffield. These were tasked with intercepting any hostile air attacks before they could reach the aircraft carriers and inflict critical damage. There were also a number of Sea Harrier jump jets in the air performing combat patrols to the northeast. HMS Glasgow would be the first ship in the task force to pick up radar contact with the hostile Argentine jets at 9:57 a.m. Glasgow's operations room snapped into gear, identifying the location of the Super Attendard jet and relaying a warning to the rest of the task force. But HMS Sheffield, the closest of the ships to the incoming hostile aircraft, remained silent. Sheffield was using their satellite communication system. This temporarily blocked out certain radar frequencies and meant that Sheffield could not see the incoming contact that Glasgow could. Captain Paul Hodenow of HMS Glasgow had previously banned the use of this system on his ship during daylight hours, but over on Sheffield, Captain Sam Salt had not installed the same ban. At 9:58 a.m, Commander Bedoccaratz and Lieutenant Mayora once again climbed to make a radar sweep, as they were now just 20 miles away from the British. They right away identified 2 radar contacts, one smaller than the other. They believed the larger ship was an aircraft carrier. With that, they had their targets and pushed forward, preparing to launch their missiles. By now, HMS Glasgow had direct radar contact with the approaching aircraft. The ship's anti-air warfare officer, Lieutenant Commander Nick Hawkyard, quickly reported the incoming raid, but he was frustrated with the response from HMS Invincible. Invincible, it seemed, assumed that these contacts made by Glasgow were just more radar false alarms being detected due to the poor weather. There had been so many that morning already. So this meant that the Harrier jets, who were conducting air patrols to the north of the carrier group, were not rerouted to intercept the incoming hostile jets. HMS Glasgow frantically radioed HMS Sheffield once again at 10 a.m. They were trying to warn them of incoming strikes. But once again, there was radio silence from Sheffield. At this exact moment, the ship's anti-air warfare officer and one of the radio operators had both momentarily stepped out of the operations room, leaving it rudderless. HMS Sheffield had also not made any radar contact with the Argentinian jets. This was now because Glasgow had given the bearing of the contacts as being 235 degrees. But from Sheffield, the aircraft would have shown up on a bearing of 300 degrees. And this confusion led to Sheffield radar operators looking in the wrong place and seeing nothing. Therefore, they too assumed it was a false alarm. The Super Étendard jets were now just 12 miles away and closing in. The jets lined themselves along with Sheffield by hard turning starboard. Lieutenant Commander Hawkyard was called urgently to return to his post via the intercom. This was the point where almost all aboard the Sheffield became aware that something was seriously wrong. But before Hawkyard could reach the ops room, both Argentine pilots fired a pair of Exocet missiles and turned hard away to begin their quick run back to Argentina. It was exactly 10:02 a.m. Exocet missiles will travel at more than 700 miles per hour. HMS Sheffield had just seconds to react. Glasgow quickly fired chaff disbursements, small metal filaments which are designed to confuse the Exocet's guidance radar into missing its target. On Sheffield, Lieutenant Commander Hawkyard misidentified the raid as a pair of Mirage 3 jets. He made this assumption as he firmly believed that the Super Étendard jets did not have the range to be able to reach the British ships. But given how it was the Super Étendards who carried the Exocet missiles, Hawkyard felt the threat to be lesser than it was. Seconds later, the bridge on the Sheffield identified the missile trails heading their way. No message was relayed to the ops room, to the captain, or to the crew. No chaff was fired from Sheffield. Back over on HMS Glasgow, Captain Hodenow ordered the launch of 2 Sea Dart missiles, hoping to intercept the incoming Exocet missiles. The Sea Darts, however, were designed to engage with high-altitude threats, so this meant that they had difficulty locking on to the low and fast Exocets. Most of Sheffield's crew were unaware that there was an imminent threat to their ship. At 10:03 a.m, HMS Sheffield's time had run out. The Exocet fired first by Commando Bedokarats smashed into Sheffield's starboard side and caused a huge fire in the auxiliary machine room. The ship immediately lost half of its power and its communications. Thick black smoke forced the evacuation of the bridge and the ops room, and a ruptured water main crippled any firefighting efforts. The computer system for the ship's missiles also failed, leaving Sheffield entirely defenseless if any subsequent attacks came. Lieutenant Commander John Wood and his 5-man team remained at post in the ship's computer room. They were working desperately to try and restore the ship's defences, even as thick black smoke filled the air and the raging fire crept closer. They were eventually successful, but all 5 men would perish in the process. Shortly after the Exocet impact, the frigates HMS Yarmouth and HMS Arrow arrived at the scene to offer assistance, providing hoses and pumps to try and beat back the flames, which were rapidly engulfing the centre of Sheffield. Sea King helicopters were scrambled to the ship and began to evacuate casualties to HMS Hermes. News cameras aboard Hermes were at the location to capture the casualties being choppered in.
Also in the galley was the Master-at-Arms, naval policeman. About 10 to 2, the water's still unboiled. So I asked one of the chefs, Tony Marshall, I said, Tony, can you give us a shout up top when the water's boiled? He said, yeah, not a problem. So I left the galley, back up 3 decks. So I went up to the bridge wing, starboard bridge wing, and the helicopter pilot was there. Me and the pilot were looking out. And then, I don't know, 2 o'clock-ish, so 10 minutes after I left the galley, 2 o'clock-ish, we looked out and the helicopter pilot shouted, "Exocet." And we looked out and we see this fireball coming towards us. And I don't know what max speed it was, but it was fast. And saying that, that's on paper, it's fast. When you look at it in reality, everything, and when I look back, it's like still frame, slow motion. And basically, the next thing we heard was a thud. It was a bang and an explosion. And the missile came in. We heard a broadcast, brace, brace, like you hear on civilian airlines, and brace, 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 which means take cover, or what cover you could. And I took cover where I said about the 20mm Oerlikons. We have ready-use lockers full of ammunition. And I sort of ducked behind there. I didn't want to let you think, what a prat, you know, if anything came in. And it wasn't long before the missile came in that we were getting black smoke. We got told that if you're down below in a smoke-filled compartment, your gas mask would give you about 6 minutes of breathing capability. One of the petty officers, he went through what they call a manhole cover, and it's an entry, an escape entry and exit into the ship. And he went down with a gas mask on, and he was trying to get any emergency apparatus back up to the ship so we could try and fight fire. And he went down 2 or 3 times. And then they brought him up, he was dead. I didn't know then, it wasn't until approximately 24 hours later, that everyone that I'd just been talking to in the galley were dead. I suffered guilt, thinking I should have died. People have told me, well, no, you shouldn't have been there in the first place. I suffer flashbacks, survivor's guilt. 40 years on, there's not a day goes by where I don't think about it. Anniversaries, 4th of May, I got a routine. We have reunions. November, I remember all the ship hits. And I'll never forget them.
Firefighters battled for 4 hours against the fire in an attempt to save the ship, but it was a battle that they sadly lost. By 1:50 p.m, Captain Salt assessed the ship's combat value, and it was now at 0. Keeping any personnel on board was now not worth the risk. Captain Salt gave the order to abandon ship. The crew were ferried over to HMS Yarmouth and HMS Arrow, while Captain Salt and his officers were flown to HMS Hermes to report directly to Rear Admiral Woodward. Woodward, grappling with the implication of that morning's events, told Captain Salt, quote,
"I suspect someone has been bloody careless."
20 men had died, and 1/3 of the UK's specialist anti-air ships in the war had been lost. The task force was now dangerously exposed until reinforcements in the shape of HMS Exeter and HMS Cardiff could arrive.
In the course of its duties within the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, HMS Sheffield, a Type 42 destroyer, was attacked and hit late this afternoon by an Argentine missile. The ship caught fire, which spread out of control. When there was no longer any hope of saving the ship's company abandoned ship. All who abandoned her were picked up. It is feared that there have been a number of casualties, but we have no details of them yet. Next of kin will be informed first as soon as details are received.
That was the Ministry of Defence spokesman Ian MacDonald, breaking the news of HMS Sheffield to the British nation. The task force slowly had to come to terms with this significant blow. News reports of HMS Sheffield also reached Argentina, who viewed it as revenge for the sinking of the General Belgrano by Britain 2 days earlier. Meanwhile, Margaret Thatcher's war cabinet planned a significant strike on the Argentine mainland to enact critical retribution against the Argentinians. But this was, at the very last minute, decided against, fearing that international sympathy for the UK's cause may dwindle if innocent civilians were caught up in any British strikes. The charred remains of HMS Sheffield remained afloat for several days after she was hit. Once the fire had burned itself out, the ship was towed by HMS Yarmouth to the edge of the exclusion zone. The hole that the Exocet had created was just above the waterline of the ship, so it quickly began to take in water, eventually capsizing and sinking into the South Atlantic waters. The sinking of the HMS Sheffield was the first British warship lost by enemy action since the Second World War. It became a stark reminder to the British government and the British public of the realities of fighting a war. But from a military perspective, it also hardened the British task force's resolve to see the campaign through to a victorious conclusion. After days of fighting at sea and in the air, attention would now turn to the plans for a full-scale amphibious landing on the Falkland Islands and some of the most tense days of the entire war. The decision was made to land British troops at San Carlos Bay on East Falkland. It was far enough away from the main Argentine positions to be confident of a smooth landing. But there was one major problem identified right away. An Argentinian air base was identified on Pebble Island, which was just off the north coast of the main island. It housed what the British thought likely to be Picara ground attack aircraft. These were propeller-powered planes and armed with bombs and rocket pods, as well as 20mm cannons. They could inflict severe damage on any landed troops, especially given how close they would be to the landing site, just 4 minutes away by air. This made Pebble Island a substantial risk. It was a risk that Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward was not prepared to accept. Woodward gave the order for the base to be neutralised. Whilst the order itself was a simple one, achieving it would not be a simple task. The options on the table to the British forces were bombardment of the airfield from air or by ship out at sea, but this was quickly ruled out as not being a guaranteed neutralisation option. It's possible that during any bombardment that aircraft could survive or escape. There was also a risk to the island's civilians, who of course were all British. There was another option, however. Major Cedric Delves, the commanding officer of D Squadron, Special Air Service, was aboard HMS Hermes, and he came up with a suggestion for Woodward to consider. Major Delves had Pebble Island as a potentially lucrative target for him and his team to support with. SAS troops would land on the island by helicopter and disable the airfield, including any aircraft, covertly with demolition charges and anti-tank weapons. That was their proposal, and it was a ballsy one. Who dares wins, right? The plan echoed similar operations that the SAS had carried out in North Africa during the Second World War. Covert actions behind enemy lines. Whilst Woodward liked the idea, he also understood the potential risks to be massive. Any information about the target was scant at best. During the cover of night on May 11th, a reconnaissance team was dispatched to gather intelligence at the airfield. Captain Timothy Burles led the reconnaissance team, but bad weather prevented any reliable data gathering until the dawn of May 13th. By then, time was running low. Rear Admiral Woodward then set a deadline of May 15th to complete the operation. Captain Burles was finally able to report the presence of 11 Argentine aircraft, and thus the operation was quickly greenlit. The early hours of May 15th would be go time for the SAS. The Special Air Service troops would be flown to and from their target by Sea King helicopters from their base aboard the HMS Hermes. Major Delves needed to prepare his men for a deployment about which they knew very little. They were going in blind, essentially. They also had very little time to prepare, and for the most part, they would be deploying to a location with almost no information about their target or what they were up against. The plan did at least benefit from being very simple. It would be a frontal attack for the entire squadron, who were relying on surprise and chaos as their chief allies. Shock and disruption. Major confusion. 18 troop unit and 16 troop unit would join the already deployed 17 troop unit who were at the location gathering intelligence and remaining hidden. Waiting, watching, ready to strike. There would be 19 troop unit in support roles too. The mission was to render all aircraft, ground facilities and aircrew neutralised. Soon, on May 14th at 6 p.m, HMS Hermes detached from the fleet and sped west. She would position herself along with HMS Glamorgan and HMS Broadsword, her destroyer and frigate protectors, just 100 or so miles off the coast of the Falkland Islands. Huge gale force winds quickly emerged, causing the three ships to slow down, battling huge waves as a result. Their targeted mission time began to slip. The Trinity's 6-hour journey would take closer to 7, and the Sea King helicopter deployment, with the raiding party aboard, did not leave Hermes until 2:25 a.m, behind schedule. As the British Special Forces made their way towards the target, HMS Glamorgan was moving into position to provide naval gunfire support to the troops on the ground. D Squadron arrived on Pebble Island at 3:50 a.m, keeping their arrival hidden from the Argentines. To do this, they landed around 5 kilometers, or 3.1 miles away from the target. From there, the team would then hike into position, which would take until just after 6 a.m. For the safety of the carrier, the British troops would need to be extracted no later than 7:30 a.m. This left Major Delves and his team just 90 minutes to execute their mission. Thus, D Squadron positioned their mortars and the assault troops were sent forward. 18 Troop had fallen behind during the hike, so they were replaced with 19 Troop under Captain Gavin Hamilton. The airfield on Pebble Island was defended by a detachment under Lieutenant Maranga from the Argentine 3rd Marine Battalion. As the SAS force approached, most of the Argentines were asleep in their beds. There was a small moving patrol of 4 men, which included Maranga himself, on duty. In addition, there were 2 guards at the airbase. At 7 a.m, and to the total surprise of the Argentinians, all hell broke loose. The troops under Captains Hamilton and Burles charged onto the airfield, opening fire with MP5 machine guns, grenades and anti-tank launchers, striking anything which looked even remotely hostile. HMS Glamorgan simultaneously opened fire, bombarding the northern section of the airfield with a dense wave of explosions and hellfire. The chaos was hoped to encourage Argentine defenders to keep their heads down, although several of the guards did return some fire on the British assault group. With that said, the Argentines found that it was almost impossible to aim or even see through the smoke, SAS mortar shelling and dawn light. Lieutenant Maranga and his men were powerless to stop the SAS from closing in on their main concentration of aircraft on the western side of the airfield. Argentines stationed at the base later commented that they had never come up against such a ferocious and sustained wall of gunfire, explosion and fire as this before. The attack was overwhelming. Within minutes, the SAS began destroying the Argentinian aircraft, before sweeping around to tackle the aircraft to the south of the Argentine guard hut too. As the raid progressed, Lieutenant Maranga began to worry that the attack was a precursor to a larger landing to seize the airfield entirely. He was determined to prevent the British from making use of Pebble Island, so he moved to activate a series of explosive charges on the runway to render it unusable. This was just as Corporal Armstrong was placing an explosive charge on the final Picara plane. The massive explosion from the Argentine charges destroyed the runway and also destroyed a Skyvan transport aircraft, saving the SAS a job. Every single aircraft at the airfield was now destroyed and on fire. The SAS mission was complete. The Argentinian assumption that the British wanted to seize the airfield was incorrect. The British merely wanted to destroy it. At 7:30 a.m, as the sun was rising, it was time for the British to move out. Major Delves ordered his squadron to pull back to the rendezvous with the Sea King helicopters. The SAS men scrambled aboard and were transported back to HMS Hermes. The raid lasted for just 30 minutes. It was planned and executed at lightning speed in the face of a harsh South Atlantic winter. All 11 Argentine aircraft had been destroyed, and as a bonus the airfield was also incapacitated, meaning that the Argentines could not move any more aircraft into the area. 2 Argentine soldiers were injured in the attack also. The stage was now set for Britain to launch their ground invasion of the Falkland Islands. But despite all the planning, preparation and special operations, the landings at San Carlos remained a fundamentally risky proposition. Under the leadership of Commodore Mike Clapp, a large number of warships, dedicated landing ships, and a requisition of merchant ships would have to sail right up to the shoreline and remain there, exposed to whatever Argentina could throw at them for days on end, until the 5 Royal Marine and Parachute battalions had been unloaded and a secure beachhead was established. Facing the British on the island was an Argentine army under the military governor of the Falklands, Brigadier General Mario Menendez. Knowing that any British reconquest of the islands could only be successful if they captured the town of Stanley, Menendez was content to concentrate the bulk of his forces around the capital. Smaller garrisons were maintained in outlying areas, which included Goose Green and the San Carlos landing site. The amphibious group of ships carrying the troops joined up with Rear Admiral Woodward's carrier task force on May 18th. They managed to achieve an undetected approach to San Carlos 2 days later, thanks to a thick sheet of fog which had descended over the islands. The ships made their final approach after dark, with SAS Special Forces operations injected to take out any Argentine observation post located at Fanning Head and also to pin down the garrison at Goose Green. Their aim was to prevent any reinforcements of Argentine troops relocating to intervene with the British troop landings. The British troops began to come ashore at 4 a.m, beginning with the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment at the southern end of San Carlos Water. The landings were largely unchallenged, with the only Argentine unit in the area being a detachment under 1st Lieutenant Carlos Esteban at Port San Carlos. This group pulled back out of the settlement once the full scale of the British landing became clear. Lieutenant Esteban's unit fought a fierce defence before being compelled to withdraw by the 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment, which liberated Port San Carlos and raised the British flag. The reconquest of the Falkland Islands was underway, but the battle for San Carlos was far from over. As soon as British troops had stepped foot on the Falklands on the morning of May 21st, Argentina launched a determined attack on the beachhead with jet strike aircraft. They were operating at maximum range from their base on the Argentine mainland with no fighter escort. The Argentine attacks on May 21st primarily focused on the British warships outside of the main San Carlos inlet. The ships outside of the inlet were purposefully placed by the British to act as protector ships, positioned to draw attacks away from the dozens of ships unloading troops at the San Carlos beaches. Falkland Sound would soon become known as Bomb Alley amongst the British troops. Whilst the Argentine Air Force focused their strikes on the protector ships, they would face difficulty breaking through a wall of hell in the shape of British ship-based missile systems. 4.5-inch naval guns, Sea Harrier jump jets, and land-based Rapier anti-air missiles. The British unleashed a military tactic known as rapid dominance, also known as shock and awe to our American friends. This tactic was a methodology that used overwhelming power and spectacular displays of force to paralyze the enemy's perception of the battlefield and destroy their will to fight. The frigate HMS Argonaut was the first to be hit by 2 bombs from the Argentine Skyhawks, before HMS Antrim was struck by a bomb from an Argentine IAI Dagger air attack. None of these bombs exploded, however, as they had been fused incorrectly for the altitude that they were dropped from. The British were not so lucky later that afternoon, however, when 2 pairs of Skyhawk strike jets speeded their way towards HMS Ardent. One of the 2 aircraft was immediately downed by a Royal Navy Sea Harrier jet, but the other got through. The Seahawk dropped a pair of 500-pound bombs on the frigate, with just one exploding and causing damage to the ship's hangar and the Seacat missile system. HMS Ardent lost power to her defense gun. The ship was almost completely defenseless when at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, 5 more Argentinian Skyhawks appeared and headed directly for the damaged British frigate. The ship's crew had little to defend themselves with and could not stop at least 2 more bombs exploding on board, cracking the hull and starting huge fires that soon threatened the torpedo and missile storage. Commander Alan West, the ship's captain, was left with little alternative but to abandon ship, with the surviving crew taken off HMS Ardent, which then sank overnight. Britain had lost Ardent, while both Argonaut and Antrim were out of action until unexploded ordnance could be defused. On board Ardent, 33 sailors had been killed in the second Argentine attack, and 20 were injured on the Argentine side. 10 Argentine jets had been shot down and destroyed, which was a quarter of all Argentine jets launched on that day. The British troops were now ashore by the end of May 21st. On May 22nd, the attacks resumed. At 12:40 p.m, an Argentine Skyhawk strike group of 4 planes, which was led by Captain Pablo Caballo, approached HMS Broadsword, HMS Yarmouth, and HMS Antelope, which were positioned just south of Fanning Island. One aircraft was immediately fought off with a Seacap missile. Another was shot down by 20mm cannon fire from HMS Antelope. The 2 remaining Argentine jets got through, dropping 2 1,000-pound bombs on Antelope, but once again they failed to detonate. However, Antelope would sink later that night when one of the failed Argentine bombs exploded during defusement by Staff Sergeant James Prescott. It caused a fire which tore through the ship's Seacat missile storage, which then exploded, causing significant damage to Antelope. The ship had already been fully evacuated by this point. Just several hours later, the Argentine Air Force struck once again. They were focused on attacking the British transport ships. The landing ships Sir Lancelot and Sir Galahad were both hit, but with bombs that once again did not explode. May 25th was Argentina's National Day, which meant that despite heavy losses of aircraft, the Argentine Air Force would summon all of its remaining strength for an all-out attack on the British ships at San Carlos. To the Argentine forces, it would be a symbolic strike and hopefully a significant victory for them. It would prove to be the best day of the entire war for them. The British were entirely aware of the importance of the day to their adversaries. They were awaiting a large-scale assault. To defend against this, Rear Admiral Woodward moved the British carrier group closer to San Carlos to reduce the flight time for Sea Harrier patrols to and from the combat area. He also maintained a pair of air defence ships northwest of Falkland Sound. This tactic began effectively. HMS Coventry shot down 2 Skyhawk aircraft with its Sea Dart missiles. But that afternoon, 4 other Seahawk jets approached from different directions simultaneously. First, Coventry's Sea Darts failed to fire, and then HMS Broadsword's Seawolf did likewise. The British ships were virtually helpless as First Lieutenant Mariano Velasco dropped 3 bombs onto the Coventry after Sea Dart defences failed to fire. All bombs exploded, causing the destroyer to sink quickly. Further that same afternoon, 2 Exocet-armed Super Attendard jets attacked the British carrier group. They struck SS Atlantic Conveyor, which triggered a huge fire. The fire ripped through the ship and destroyed 10 Chinook and Wessex helicopters in the fire's path. The attack on the SS Conveyor was the large major attack during the battle for San Carlos. Following this raid, the Argentine Air Force were in difficulty after 21 of its 61 aircraft had been destroyed by the British. Yes, they sunk 3 British ships, but further attacks would likely decimate the Argentine Air Force, so they stepped back. The British, however, had managed to establish their land party and forces ashore the Falklands, and they could now prepare for their offensive eastwards. The British troops would have to walk east towards the island's capital, Stanley. As 10 of the Royal Navy's helicopters had been lost, any troop transport had also been lost with them. The British wasted no time in going into offensive mode, however. May 28th saw the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment assault an outlying Argentine position at Goose Green. It was a ferocious, tough day of fighting, which cost the life of the battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jones. But the Paras Regiment captured the local airfield and completely encircled Argentine forces who were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Italo Piaggi. The British faced a surrender from the Argentine troops, subsequently gaining more than 1,000 prisoners. The victory at Goose Green was the first major land victory for the British. The reconquest of the Falkland Islands was now well underway. The 5th Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Tony Wilson arrived at San Carlos at the end of May. They were accompanied by Major General Jeremy Moore, who would now take overall command of the British forces on the islands. 2 para-regiments, which were at Goose Green following its successful offensive there, were now attached to the 5th Infantry Brigade. It was now their mission to secure the southern approaches to Stanley. Brigadier Julian Thompson's 3rd Commando Brigade solidified their position to the north of the capital. Brigadier Wilson ordered 2 units to take Bluff Cove. Reconnaissance had revealed that no Argentinians were present at the settlements there. Moving the 5th Brigade forwards was a challenge, as the shortage of helicopters forced the Welsh and Scots Guards to be transported to Bluff Cove by sea. By June 10th, Major General Moore had 7 battalions ready to advance on the Argentine stronghold at Stanley. These units included the 3 Commando Brigade, the 3 Para Regiment, 40 Commando Brigade and 42 Commando Brigade. These forces were joined by the Scots Guards and the 5th Infantry. Meanwhile, positioned at the southwest of Stanley at the town of Fitzroy were the 2 Para-Regiment, the 1st Gurkhas Unit and the Welsh Guards. 2 companies of 40 commando units also provided backup and reinforcements at Fitzroy. The plan was for 2 back-to-back night attacks to seize all of the high ground west of Stanley, making it impossible for the Argentines to hold out in the town. In reserve of these attacking units were just 2 companies of the 40 Commando Unit, who were positioned at the San Carlos landing site, and a single company of Gurkhas, who were holding Goose Green. The British were throwing almost everything that they had on the island into the attack. Even with all of these forces, they were still outnumbered by the 9,000-strong Argentine forces positioned at Stanley. 5,000 of these Argentine units were frontline combat troops, so the British were the underdogs in terms of numbers, and they knew this. Brigadier General Menendez, the Argentine commander on the Falkland Islands, had positioned his units in a naturally strong defensive position. They were dug in within the hills just west of Stanley, with the Argentine 7th Regiment, 4th Regiment, and 5th Marine Battalions holding the front line. Argentina did have other infantry units. There were further regiments positioned near the east coast in case the British attempted amphibious landings close to the capital. But the British felt that Argentina would be expecting this, and it would be better to split the forces and attack the split one at a time. For clarity, the Argentine regiments were battalion-sized units roughly equivalent in size to the British units, which they would be facing off against. Now the issue for Argentina was that they had stretched their forces out much too wide. Worse still, the Argentinian 5th Marine Battalion was the only unit that had proper cold weather equipment and battle experience. By comparison, for example, the Argentinian 4th Regiment, who were located to the west of the 5th, were normally stationed in the tropical climate of Corrientes, which was right on the Brazilian border. These troops were not used to the cold weather, nor were they equipped for it. General Menendez was concerned that his men were outgunned and outexperienced by the British. He requested reinforcements on June 10th, but this request was refused immediately. The Argentinian leader, General Galtieri, was not prepared to risk losing any more naval or air force assets to British defences, so General Menendez was instead ordered to fight to the death with what he had. The evening of June 11th saw the launch of the British attack. 3 battalions pushed forward to assault the 3 points of the outer Argentine defences. These defence garrisons were positioned at Mount Harriet, 2 Sisters, and Mount Longdon. The offensive began with both 42 Commando on Mount Harriet and 45 Commando attacking 2 Sisters. They quickly overcame their opponents within a few short hours. Just a single British soldier was killed at Mount Harriet, and 4 at 2 Sisters, which was a significantly fierce and bloody battle. 3 Para-Regiment attacked the Argentine positions at Mount Longdon. Longdon was smaller than the other positions which were attacked that night, and all 3 were hills, but Longdon was a lot larger than 2 Sisters and Harriet. It was also rugged, rocky, and contained narrow channels which had heavy machine guns installed by the Argentine Defence Forces. The 3 Paratroopers Regiment would need to push through these channels under heavy gunfire. B Company became badly stuck on the western slopes. 4 Platoon was also in particular danger. The unit had become pinned down in the open by a steady bombardment of gunfire from the rocks above. The platoon commander was lost to injury, and its frightful position was only alleviated when Sergeant Ian Mackey led a crazy and entirely dangerous assault on 2 key Argentine positions alone. Mackey knew that he had to make significant efforts to resolve the position that the unit was stuck in, so he struck the Argentines almost single-handedly. Mackey neutralized both Argentine positions quickly, but he would be cut down in the process. In death, Mackey would ultimately receive a posthumous Victoria Cross for his gallantry in battle. The platoon were now able to place themselves in a much better position on the hill thanks to Mackey's sacrifice. B Company was able to push the Argentine defenders under Major Carlos Salvadores back further and further, which eventually enabled the company to sweep through their positions entirely and clear Mount Longdon altogether. Whilst it was a savage battle with 23 British paras being killed and 35 being wounded, Argentina's defensive ring around Port Stanley was reduced and significantly weakened. All 3 key hill positions were captured by the British, with Argentina suffering severe casualties in the process. 73 Argentine troops were killed across the 3 positions, and more than 200 were severely wounded. The British also took more than 20 prisoners from the Argentine ranks during the battle. The Scots Guards and Gurkhas were now brought up to prepare for their assault on Mount Tumbledown and Mount William. British artillery positions significantly increased their bombardment of Argentine positions. The final British offensive of the Falklands War began on June 13th, just as the sun went down. The Scots Guards marched on to assault Mount Tumbledown. Tumbledown had an almost sheer northern face, and its southern slopes were overlooked by Argentinian positions located at Mount William. This was a challenge for the British. A direct assault from the west was their only option. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Scott initially launched a diversionary assault south of Mount William, which would occur prior to the main offensive. This would be an attempt to draw the defending Argentine troops' attention away. And it worked. G Company was able to capture the first third of Tumbledown without even being detected by the enemy. The left flank company took over the attack, but quickly became pinned down by heavy Argentine gunfire from the top of the ridge above them. It took several hours for the British to push through, but push through they did, supported in part with massive artillery bombardment on the Argentine positions. Mount Tumbledown was secured, but the delay meant that there was no time for the Gurkhas to attack Mount William before dawn. They would have to strike during the daylight. Meanwhile, the Para Regiment were closing in on Port Stanley. Unlike the other British battalion commanders, Lieutenant Colonel David Chaudler decided on a noisy attack for his operation. With a large artillery bombardment beforehand and a display of overwhelming firepower being used to secure his objectives. More rapid dominance tactics to overwhelm the enemy forces. Both Scorpion and Scimitar tanks were ordered in to support the Para Regiment, along with extensive artillery and mortar strikes. Heavy naval gunfire from the opposite coast also rained down on the Argentine positions in further rapid dominance. All this firepower quickly forced the Argentine units off their defending ridge and falling back towards Stanley. The British didn't allow their retreat to be easy, however, as they rained down a thick curtain of fire from both directions on the Argentines. Major Roberto Bereze declared that the defence of Stanley had collapsed, and thus hundreds of Argentine troops poured east into the Falklands capital, running for their lives as heavy British artillery showered down upon their retreat. Brigadier Thompson ordered his battalions to keep advancing. 2 Para headed straight on the road into Port Stanley, and 45 Commando Unit headed up Sapper Hill. This was the last remaining high ground position that was still in Argentinian hands. The Welsh Guards also pushed forward when they were helicoptered onto the summit of Sapper Hill, just as 45 Commando was arriving. Argentina Brigadier General Menendez realized on the morning of June 14th that the Argentine forces had been completely beaten. The British had them completely surrounded by both land and sea. The British held the high ground. The Argentine forces were overwhelmed and low on ammunition, equipment, and morale. Their military organization and structure was also falling apart as their soldiers panicked and feared for their lives. General Menendez concluded that the only course of action was to unconditionally surrender. Despite General Galtieri's objections from Buenos Aires, that's exactly what Menendez ultimately did. The Argentine forces made contact with the British, and a British negotiating team arrived that afternoon. Terms of the Argentine surrender were agreed, and then General Moore flew in that evening to sign the documents of Argentine surrender with General Menendez. General Moore reported to London, quote,
"Today, General Menendez of the Argentine Armed Forces has surrendered all of the Argentine Armed Forces in East and West Falkland. the Falkland Islands are once again under the government desired by their inhabitants. God save the Queen.
The British flag was raised over Port Stanley, and the British mission to the South Atlantic had been achieved. Britain had lost 255 soldiers during the war and suffered 775 wounded, whilst Argentina had lost 649 soldiers and had 1,657 of their men wounded. The many thousands of Argentine prisoners of war that were captured were returned back to Argentina a few days after the unconditional surrender. They returned home to a country in despair. General Galtieri had been deposed. As the Falklands had been retaken by the British, and because the administration ruled by military figures had completely failed to contain the British military response, Galtieri's military junta began to fall apart. Galtieri was blamed for the defeat by his own forces and by the general public in Argentina. He was quickly removed from power, and democracy was slowly restored to the country. Galtieri and other members of his military junta were arrested in 1983 and charged in a military court with human rights violations and the mismanagement of the Falklands War. The Argentine army prosecuted Galtieri under the Code of Military Justice. General Galtieri was sentenced to 12 years in prison in 1986, although he would be pardoned in 1989 by then Argentinian President Carlos Menem. There was public anguish over the nation's defeat across Argentina. Whilst in the UK, the end of the Falklands War gave a huge boost to the British government. There were scenes of celebration and public jubilation on the streets. The British military task force returned home during the summer of 1982, and they were victorious, triumphant, and HMS Hermes and SS Canberra were met by huge cheering crowds when they reached port. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government climbed to new heights of popularity with the British public. The victory in the Falklands and the handling of the Iranian embassy siege in 1980 contributed heavily to a Thatcher landslide re-election in 1983 and ensured that the Conservatives remained in power in the UK all the way until 1997. For the Falkland Islanders themselves, their belief in their Britishness and separateness from Argentina was only strengthened by the war. Ultimately, Argentina had pushed the islands further and further away. Today, the islands remain, as they always have, a British overseas territory who are dependent on the UK for their economy and security. The Falklands are a colony under a democratic government of their own choosing that remains part of the British Commonwealth, a decision the Falkland Islanders have made for themselves in a democratic vote. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.